Hello, I'm Jay Shadler. Our first story from 1998 explores the relationship between a woman convicted of homicide and her son, whose life became a quest to prove her innocence.
If the authorities in Cameron County, Texas could have their way, Susie Mowbray would still be in prison. In 1988, she was convicted of a gruesome murder, shooting her husband in the head as he slept. But Cameron County ran into a force it never expected in Susie's son, Wade Burdett.
She did not commit a homicide that night.
Wade was 17 when his mother was sent away to prison for life. As he grew up, he took on the daunting task of getting her conviction overturned.
Prosecutors made a career for themselves by taking my mom's life away, her freedom. And defense attorneys weren't any better.
Susie and Bill Mowbray wed in the late 1970s. Bill was a wealthy, successful Cadillac dealer in Brownsville. But almost from the start, Susie says, marriage to Bill Mowbray was difficult.
There was that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality that I would, mood swings, volatile.
Susie's children by an earlier marriage, Wade and daughter Cricket, remember being frightened by their new stepfather.
If he was happy, he was very happy. If he was not happy, he was very angry.
I think he was definitely manic depressive.
When he was despondent, Susie says, Bill often threatened suicide. He had even shot himself once before they were married. Then one night, he actually did it. She told police she was awakened to hear Bill crying on the other side of the bed.
It scared the hell out of me.
When did you know he had a gun?
When I reached up to touch him, and his arm was just solid, it wouldn't come down.
At that moment, Susie says, the gun went off. She ran downstairs and called Bill's longtime business associate, Luke Fruia.
She said, Luke, he did it. He shot himself.
I don't know who to call, Luke. What do I do?
Kind of in hysterics, and I told her, look, don't worry about it. I'll be right there. I'll take care of everything.
Emergency units arrived to find Bill Mowbray lying in a fetal position under the covers, a bullet wound through his temple.
She said he did it.
Yes, sir.
And you immediately equated that, though, with suicide.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mowbray was a very lonely person.
Luke was the general manager at Bill's dealership and one of only a few people who knew how fragile Bill really was. He had spent so much the dealership was near collapse. Luke, his right-hand man, was leaving the next day to take another job, and the IRS was closing in on Bill Mowbray with possible criminal indictments.
He had indicated to me several times, he said, Luke, there's no way I'm going to jail, and there's no way I'm going to spend one night in jail. He said, I'd kill myself before I do that.
Right.
And I told him, I said, Mr. Mowbray, you got to be kidding. It can't be that serious. He said, it is that serious.
1 week later, Bill was dead.
Mr. Mowbray committed suicide. There's no doubt in my mind.
But the authorities thought otherwise. They focused not on Bill's troubles, but on how Susie reacted just after the fatal shot.
In this day and age, Mr. Gerald, you have 4-year-olds who know how to use 911.
Louis Sands was then an assistant district attorney assigned to prosecute Susie Mowbray.
Here you have an adult who, instead of dialing 911 because, God's sake, your husband is shot, what does she do? She calls first person, a business associate. He did it. He did what?
The dead man's family became suspicious too. Bill's cousin, Scott Mowbray, was bothered by the fact that when police arrived, they reported Susie seemed cool and collected.
She was smoking a cigarette and had a drink of some sort in her hand. And they asked her, where's Bill? And she pointed at the house. They went in and looked for him. She did not say, let me follow and let me take you to where he is. They had to search the home to find him.
Within days, Susie Mowbray became the prime suspect in a sensational murder case.
The fate of Susie Mowbray hangs on which side is able to best show what happened in her bedroom earlier.
It was just a soap opera kind of case is what it was.
The judge was Gilbert Hinojosa.
You know, it had everything. It had murder, it had money, it had sex, it had, intrigue.
Prosecutors painted Susie Mowbray as a pampered woman who wanted more. The motive, they said, $1.8 million in life insurance. And they told the jury Susie herself had been checking on those policies just weeks before her husband's death.
The most dramatic moment of the trial came when prosecutors brought in the bloody bed where the shooting occurred and placed it here, squarely in front of the jury. An expert witness used a dummy to represent the victim and showed how tiny specks of blood he saw on Susie Mowbray's nightgown could only have gotten there had she stood or knelt over her husband and fired the fatal shot.
Well, the way he presented it, it seemed very impossible that he could have committed suicide.
Mary Alice Torres was one of the jurors.
Susie Mowbray guilty of murder.
Everybody decided that she was guilty.
A unanimous first vote decision.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I just don't understand.
At the age of 40, Susie Mowbray was locked away to spend the rest of her life in a Texas prison. After 3 appeals were filed and denied, there was little hope left.
A son's search for justice when we return. Susie Mowbray had resigned herself to life in prison, even though she swore she had not murdered her husband. 3 appeals had already failed, and her lawyers were reluctant to try again. What Mowbray did not know was that her son, Wade, was just getting started.
Wade had grown into a confused and angry man. In college now, he resolved to find out for himself exactly what happened that night in Brownsville.
My quest initially was to find out the truth, whatever it may be.
The first stop, prison, for a long, detailed talk with his mother. On the advice of attorneys, Susie had never taken the stand in her own defense. Wade quickly realized what a terrible mistake that had been.
There were reasonable, believable, honest explanations for every single thing that the prosecution used as evidence of her guilt. And her defense attorneys didn't present one of them.
You didn't call the operator or the police yourself. You called Luke.
Right. There was no 911. That was not an option for me.
Had she been on the stand, Susie would have explained she panicked and didn't know which local number to call for help. And she would have told the jurors that, yes, she did check on Bill's insurance policies, but only because Bill asked her to. Wade was astonished.
You got to realize at the time, I'm just a college student, and I have no background in any of this, so I don't know what to do with it.
Mental fairness.
Determined now to win his mother's freedom, Wade took on the case himself. He enrolled in law school, hit the books, and spent every free moment digging through his mother's trial records, page by page.
Was there a point, one thing that overwhelmingly sent you on your way to continue this quest?
There was. I had a moment where I knew that my mom didn't do this. And I knew that the only other person who could have was Bill. It was a physical impossibility for my mom to have committed this crime.
To his surprise and disgust, the law student discovered something veteran prosecutors had known from the very beginning.
I concluded it was suicide.
Herb McDonald is the best-known expert on bloodstains in the country. In the early days of the investigation, prosecutors took Susie Mowbray's nightgown to his lab in Corning, New York, looking for evidence to build their case.
They asked me if I could find bloodstains on it. I think they wanted me to. But when I examined it in their presence, I told them that I could not find any blood spots. I couldn't find anything that appeared to be blood spots.
But jurors never heard from Herb McDonald. Prosecutors withheld his report until just days before the trial, too late for defense lawyers to use it. And Wade found something else the jurors never heard. The state had done its own chemical test on the nightgown, and it couldn't find blood either. It was the bombshell Wade had been looking for, and it was enough to convince Dallas attorney Bob Ford to help file one last appeal.
Was this a tainted prosecution in your opinion?
Oh, yes, it was a tainted prosecution. Those people ought to be ashamed of themselves.
This was intentional. They knew when they got Herbert McDonald's report that she was not in position to have done this. And rather than do the right thing and give that report to her attorneys and call off the investigation, they went out and got another expert to come in and say exactly what they needed to get a conviction.
Indeed, the prosecution's star witness was the expert who said he did see blood on the nightgown. Yet during the appeals hearing, he was forced to completely recant, admitting he had never even done a test to confirm what he saw was blood. Reviewing the case, District Court Judge Darrell Hester issued a scathing denunciation of the prosecution's tactics. In hindsight, he said, the defense may be faulted for mistakes in judgment, but the DA's office deliberately withheld evidence. At best, a questionable strategy, he said, and at worst, intentional deception. The conviction was overturned. After 9 hard years in prison, Susie was finally on her way home.
Susie, how do you feel, Susie? I want my mother. She's falling. She's falling. Mama. Don't fall.
We just kept touching each other and hugging each other, and I think we were afraid if we stopped, something would happen.
Oh, God, please.
I sort of stayed back and tried to really, really enjoy that.
Thank you for believing in me.
Here we go.
He did it. My son did it. One day, Cricket told me, she said, Mom, I always knew Wade would do something huge, but I didn't know it'd be this big.
Here's to it.
Life is good.
Life is very good.
Life is good.
After her conviction was overturned, Susie Mowbray's case was retried, this time with her son Wade, an official member of the defense team. The jury found Susie not guilty in a unanimous verdict. In Illinois, a group of journalism students took on the cause of another convicted murderer to right another miscarriage of justice. In February 1999, Anthony Porter walked out of prison a free man. He had been on death row since 1982, convicted of murder. The first thing he did on being freed was hug a Northwestern University professor and his students.
I'm free.
At one point, Porter was within 2 days of dying by lethal injection. He had been convicted of killing 2 people in this Chicago park. The professor, David Protas, regularly assigns his journalism students old murder convictions to investigate. Porter's case was a class project.
We started with an objective view of this. We didn't know whether he was guilty or innocent. Our goal was to search for the truth. And if the police had done that here, an innocent man would not have spent 16 years of his life on death row.
The students got a tip that this man, Alstery Simon, was the real killer and asked private investigator Paul Ciolino to look into it. Ciolino persuaded Simon to make a videotaped confession.
Before I knew anything, like I had felt that my life was being threatened. And before I knew anything, I just pulled it up and started shooting.
Now, what kind of weapon did you have?
I had a 38.
As time went on, he just was losing it, and he was becoming very nervous, and he was getting to the point where he wanted to tell the truth, I believe, and it came out, and finally we got him on videotape.
Simon was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Even the students were a bit amazed at what they did.
I mean, it's incredible that we can make this kind of a difference at age 21. And I think we can have a lot of faith in the justice system, but we have to learn to be skeptical.
I feel so good. I feel good, everybody. I feel good,
One of the real tragedies here is that if a group of college students and me and a private eye can solve a case that's 16 years old, boy, there's sure enough resources in order to defend these people in the first place, because Anthony Porter was an innocent man. He professed his innocence from the beginning, and he shouldn't have spent the day in prison.
Next, will a woman's cries of innocence from behind bars be heard when Justice Files returns? In 1973, Betty Tyson was a heroin addict working the streets when she was sent to prison for murder. Our next story from 1999 chronicles the journey of a woman who maintained her innocence from behind bars for a quarter century.
On May 25th, 1973, a man walking his dog in this alley found a body. It was that of a white, well-to-do, middle-aged businessman. He had been bludgeoned with a brick and strangled to death with his own necktie. Giant weeds had been shoved in his mouth and down his throat. It was a brutal murder, and it generated enormous publicity and intense pressure on police to find whoever was responsible.
Detectives quickly picked up Betty Tyson, and it seemed like an open and shut case. Police believed the victim, 52-year-old Timothy Hayworth, had been with a prostitute, and there were fresh tire tracks at the scene of the crime. Betty was one of the only prostitutes in town who had a car. 2 eyewitnesses said they saw her with Hayworth on the night of the murder. And finally, most damning of all, Betty Tyson confessed.
Why would you sign that confession if you hadn't really killed him?
I was forced to sign a statement that I knew nothing about, okay? I was handcuffed to a 2-armed chair and beaten several times.
What did they do to you?
One would take and hit me with this part of his hands this way. One would take and pull my hair and smack my head. One would take and kick me. One would hit me here. You know, I mean, this went on.
While Betty was being questioned, police picked up 21-year-old John Duval, a friend of Betty's who was seen with her on the night of the murder. Duval says he, too, was beaten when he refused to sign a confession.
They hollering and screaming, and I'm saying, no, that's not true. And after 15 minutes of that, then the beatings got worse.
During the interrogation, the detective in charge, William Mahoney, typed up this confession for Betty and Duval to sign. The statement claims that Duval choked the man with his tie while Betty shoved weeds in the man's mouth to shut him up. Betty says when she refused to sign the detective's confession, the beatings began again.
And each time they would stop, they would say, sign it, you black bee. And I'm like, I'm not signing anything.
She hit the floor, and all hell broke loose. Now, when they ran to her to jump on her, beat her up, I ran in the corner by the window. They turned the lights off and on. And I said, please. I said, please don't beat her no more. I said, I'll do anything, just don't beat her no more.
After 12 hours, Betty and Duval say they could take no more, and they both finally signed Mahoney's confessions.
Did you realize that you would go to trial and face murder charges after signing this confession?
No, I didn't.
What did you think was going to happen?
I just thought that I can get up there and tell them that they forced me to sign this statement, you know, but as it was, that doesn't work.
It didn't work partly because Detective Mahoney found 2 alleged witnesses, teenage friends of Betty and John Duval, who said they saw them with the victim on the night of the murder, and that Duval later described the murder to them. To make sure the teens would testify, the police put both of them in jail without charges for 6 months, right up to the beginning of the trial.
The case against Betty Tyson, to begin with, was very weak.
John Getz is now Betty Tyson's attorney.
There was no physical evidence that implicated Betty Tyson.
Nothing?
Nothing at all.
Not a fingerprint, not a strand of hair?
Exactly.
Remember those tire tracks at the crime scene that originally led the police to Betty Tyson in the first place? Well, it turns out this police report proved the tracks didn't match the tires on Betty Tyson's car. And at the trial, 3 witnesses swore under oath that Betty was with them at the time of the murder.
But the jury didn't believe them.
I ended up getting 25 to life for a crime that I didn't commit.
What was it like to spend all those years in prison, half your life behind bars?
In the beginning, it was rough, okay? I contemplated suicide. Then I realized that I wasn't dying. And I said, well, you're gonna have to get with it and do the best that you can.
Slowly, over time, Betty Tyson built a new life in prison. A year into her sentence, she discovered she had a talent in photography. A few years later, while her nieces and nephews were graduating from high school, Betty earned her own diploma behind bars. She says in some ways those years in prison may have even saved her life.
Do you find that at all ironic that you yourself say that if you hadn't gone to prison, if you had stayed out on the streets, you most likely would be dead? Instead, you were sent to prison.
And still living.
And you're alive.
Mm-hmm.
It took 7 long years before Betty got what she thought was her first big break. In 1980, Detective Mahoney, the lead detective in her case, was convicted of faking evidence in a case against mobsters. With this new information, Betty says she asked her lawyer at the time to reopen her case. But he said the investigation into Mahoney wasn't relevant to her.
I was like, that didn't apply to me. I was kind of heated.
You were angry?
Yes, I was.
Back home in Rochester, her nieces and nephews were growing older without her. Betty created a new family among fellow inmates.
Betty Tyson was the glue that held the community together.
Inmates like Michelle McWilliams looked up to Betty, who found a new purpose for herself in prison, helping inmates with AIDS.
A lot of women had their last breath in her arms, and she was just such a giving human being. She gave of herself.
Behind prison walls, Betty was forced to wait nearly a quarter century for her second break. As her nieces and nephews got married and her mother grew ill, Betty all but gave up hope until a local reporter came upon her story. He started digging and found Charmaine Bennett, who was a counselor at the jail back in 1973 when Betty was arrested. Bennett spoke to Betty the day after she was interrogated.
Can you describe for me what you saw on Betty Tyson's body?
Knots on her skin and also beginning of bruises. They were actually turning color.
There was no doubt in your mind she had been beaten?
No doubt in my mind at all.
At the time, Bennett went to the authorities, but her report was dismissed. Betty's defense team never even knew about Bennett.
Finally, in 1997, one of the teens who testified against Betty came forward with a surprising admission. In a sworn statement, he said that Detective Mahoney held a gun to his head and threatened him, forcing him to lie on the witness stand back in 1973. That was enough to convince John Getz to take on the case for free.
The prisons in this country are full of people who profess their innocence. Why did you believe Betty Tyson?
I think it was the character of Betty Tyson. She has so much integrity that when you know her, the bottom line is she really could not lie about something like this.
John Getz and his team forced the state to open the case again, and when they dusted off the 25-year-old police case file, they found this crucial document that had been hidden from the defense all these years. It was a police interview done back in 1973 with the second teenaged witness, in which he too said he never saw Betty with anyone resembling the victim, exactly the opposite of what he said during her trial.
When you heard they found that paper,
I was excited. I really was. I just knew eventually it was over.
After a quarter century, half of her life behind bars, it looked like Betty Tyson would finally be vindicated. A judge overturned her conviction and has called what happened to Betty a travesty of justice. But New York's longest-serving female inmate still wasn't free. The district attorney had the final say and could choose to retry Betty for the murder. On May 28th, 25 years to the day of her arrest, the DA announced his decision.
That looking at all of these surrounding circumstances of this particular case, and most importantly, looking at the interest of justice, that we will not prosecute Betty Tyson again.
Betty Tyson had been waiting a long time for this moment. And finally, when it arrived, she was met by nearly 100 friends and supporters. A stretch limo with her mother and the rest of her family waited to take Betty home.
It was amazing. She had not gotten a chance to hug her mother. And she got to hug her mom. That was it. Made every bit of work worth it.
This is what I've been waiting on for 25 years. I just knew that someday there was a light at the end of the tunnel and it was going to shine.
William Mahoney, the police detective responsible for putting Betty Tyson and John Duvall behind bars, died in 1981. In 1998, Tyson received a $1.25 million settlement from the city of Rochester for wrongful imprisonment. Today, Betty Tyson is a local celebrity in her hometown of Rochester, New York.
Who am I? Betty Tyson. That's right.
Ironically, she says her years in prison may be the reason she's alive today.
I was out there and I was buck wild. Somebody would have killed me eventually.
But while Tyson made plans for her new life, her co-defendant, John Duvall, remained behind bars. Duvall's family hoped Tyson's release would help his case.
They alleged, the police department alleged that my son and Betty Gal was two co-defendants of each other. Now, if they let her out, they should have let him out too.
In April 1999, Duvall and his family got their wish. Judge David Egan overturned his conviction, and John Duvall walked out of prison after nearly 26 years.
I'm happy to be home, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I'm just happy that justice finally prevailed after 26 years.
But Duvall's troubles were not over yet. Prosecutors still had to decide whether or not to seek a retrial of the case.
The indictment is still pending. It's just like in any other murder case, in any other bail situation. The charges are still pending.
I grew up with John Duvall. He's my cousin. I knew back then when I was a college student that he was incapable of this crime. I've known it all along.
But prosecutors didn't agree. In May 1999, the Monroe County District Attorney announced he would retry the case of John Duvall. Parents from around the country falsely accused of child abuse when Justice Files returns. Child abuse is one of society's most serious crimes. And our next story from 1997 explores what happens to parents who are falsely accused of harming their kids.
Another night of anger, violence, and child abuse, fueled by alcohol and drugs.
3 months ago, at the age of 6, she was allegedly beaten to death by her mother.
She died as she had lived, a victim of unspeakable physical and sexual abuse. Her body bore the scars.
It happens all too often. Parents abusing their children with tragic consequences. It's considered a national emergency. Teachers, social workers, and medical professionals have been put on alert and are required by law to report suspected abuse. In turn, authorities in many states have been given extraordinary powers to protect the child. These can include the power to come into your home without a search warrant, question your children, and examine them for signs of abuse, immediately remove them from the home, and even put you in jail. Great for those guilty of child abuse, but how about the innocent? Imagine this happening to you just because your child took a fall or bumped his head. Suddenly, your child's accidental injury is reported as possible abuse. That's what Michael and Donna Devon of Yonkers, New York discovered when they were falsely accused of hurting their child.
It was like the most unbelievable thing I'd ever heard of in my life. Just that moment of like, this cannot be happening. But it was.
Okay, here comes Jonathan.
For the Devon family, this journey into their personal nightmare began when their son Jonathan took a nasty fall on the sandbox at school. His teachers were watching.
Jonathan was running very fast, kind of tripped over his own 2 feet. I knew right away that it was a serious accident because he grabbed his face.
The result was this big black shiner. It looked far worse than it actually was. Later that week, when Jonathan and his dad went to the supermarket, a stranger saw the boy's black eye and approached them.
She asked me, what happened to your son? I said, he fell in school
But he's okay. We took him to the doctor. He had x-rays, and he's okay. And we went on shopping.
The answer didn't seem to satisfy the woman.
While shopping, I noticed the lady following us through the aisles. I never met the lady. I have no idea who she was, but she followed us.
Even after they left, the woman tailed them in her car. A couple of days later, while at home, a caseworker from the Child Protective Services showed up, demanding to see their son. Apparently, the woman from the supermarket had reported them as suspected child abusers. They had no choice but to allow the caseworker to enter their home.
We told her right away that it was an accident at school. I offered her all of the information that we had readily available. She had asked if we would pull up his shirt, and she asked us to pull down his pants to his underwear, and she examined his body. She said to Jonathan, "Are you afraid of your daddy?"
It was a very uncomfortable feeling. We felt accused of something that we knew that had nothing to do with what actually had happened.
So you were cooperative, law-abiding, hoping that this person would make the report and see what had happened and make some inquiries and the case would be closed.
What case? We're not a case. We're a family with a child who had an accident. But that's not the way Child Protective Services works today.
Michael and Donna Devon were fortunate. They had eyewitnesses, and the case against them was eventually dropped. But by law, their names were entered into the state of New York's database as having been investigated as suspected child abusers.
Just be careful.
Their name will remain on that list until their son turns 28. The Devons also worry that the record could work against them if their son's ever injured again.
This is a very scary situation. I don't know what's going to happen if, God forbid, something happens to my son tomorrow and I can't prove what happened to him. He's a healthy 6-year-old boy. Things happen.
The problem an innocent family faces are compounded enormously when the child is too young to say how they're injured and there are no witnesses.
Here, ducky ducky.
That happened to Jim and Jana Cox of Tampa, Florida, when Jana picked up her 11-month-old daughter, Julie, from the church nursery and noticed a bump on her head.
I was getting her out of the car seat, and as I pulled the belt up over her head, I felt the lump on her head before I saw it. It was a huge bump on the outside. I was very surprised.
They took Julie to the emergency room, where her injury was diagnosed as a skull fracture. The doctor immediately suspected abuse.
He indicated that the injury could not have occurred by an accidental fall of something like that. It was more likely it had been a deliberate blow to the head. And I'm thinking, why would anybody do that to our daughter? We didn't do that to our daughter.
The doctor reported Julie's injuries to the authorities. And that night at the hospital, a caseworker from the state appeared and questioned the Coxes, then left. Within hours, the caseworker returned with 2 sheriff's deputies and told them,
We've determined in the best interest of the children, we're going to take the children and put them into foster care for their protection. And I'm thinking, protection from who?
I was just angry or screaming that you can't take our children away. And that you're not going to take our children away.
By taking your children, they're talking about not only the one in the hospital.
The other 2 at home.
The other 2 at home. What did you say? Could you resist? Were you following
I
directives?
said there's got to be something else we can do. We've got to be able to do something else. You can't.
But you saw it as a possibility. Did you feel they had the authority with the sheriff there to enforce this?
I think so, yeah. Why else would they be there? 2 armed deputies.
What were your thoughts, Jim, about how do you deal with this?
I don't know. I was just totally confused and angry and didn't know what to do.
Close family friends, Jim and Cheryl Eckert, offered the Coxes a less drastic solution than foster care. They would move into Jim and Jana's home to care for the children. But the Coxes needed the court's approval and had to appear alongside hardened criminals in what's called video court to hear the judge's ruling.
I am going to order the kids sheltered at this time with the option for the department to place the kids wherever they're secure that they'll be safe once we finish the investigation.
The Coxes were ordered to move out of their home and were allowed only supervised visitation with their children.
We have the responsibility to determine first and foremost whether or not we have a child who could be in danger.
Linda Radigan of the Florida Department of Children and Families wouldn't comment on specific cases, but says they'll go to any lengths to protect children, even if that means removing the child first and investigating later.
That investigator is responsible for whether or not that child may live through the night or the parents may flee from the state with that child. They have to go home and sleep with the decision they've made. If they make the wrong decision, the child could die.
Is the system working to protect parents as well as children?
There is an essential balancing act that we must engage in to protect the rights of parents, but the bottom line is, it is our task to figure out whether or not we have a child who is possibly a victim.
An update on Jim and Jana Cox and their children, and men and women wrongfully placed on death row. Next on Justice File. In 1999, Michael and Donna Devon, whose son was injured on a New York playground, were working with state legislators on a new law to protect people falsely accused of child abuse. The proposed law would allow people to have their names removed from a list of abused suspects if they could provide clear and convincing evidence of their innocence. After Jim and Jana Cox's children were placed in the care of close family friends, law enforcement authorities began an investigation into their case. Detective J.W. Myers quickly realized they were innocent and that their daughter's injury was most likely the result of an accidental fall.
I met with the daycare people, I met with the church people, the neighbors, and I felt very comfortable that there was no reason to believe that this was an abusive situation.
As a result of the detectives' investigation, the case against Jim and Jana Cox was dropped, and they regained full custody of their children. But during their ordeal, they felt they had lost their rights as parents and as citizens.
It was like the U.S. Constitution didn't apply in this particular instance.
I was devastated over the injury itself.
Right.
But then when I couldn't believe that somebody just took our children away from us just like that our whole family was broken up. They had power over us.
People that have done nothing wrong, but get dragged through the mud in a situation like this. I never thought it could happen, and it's never going to go away. It'll always be there.
Every time a person is unjustly punished for a crime, faith in our criminal justice system is shattered. No one knows that better than those who have faced the ultimate punishment, execution.
My name is Dave Keaton. The state of Florida tried to kill me for a crime I did not commit.
I was sentenced to death in 1990, and I was released in 1995.
Had the state of Ohio gotten its way, I would be dead today.
You are looking at a remarkable gathering of men and women. Every person here was once under a sentence of death, wrongfully.
We have come together for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to speak out and to stop executions in America.
In the past 25 years, dozens of Americans sentenced to die were later exonerated and released when evidence of their innocence came to light. 30 of them attended this unprecedented conference at Northwestern University to speak up against the death penalty.
What's happening is intense amounts of luck. Intense luck that it happens to be that before they're rolled onto that gurney, the evidence emerges of their innocence, that some witness ends up telling the truth, that DNA evidence ends up showing that in fact they didn't commit the crime.
Americans should lose sleep at night, and at a rate of something on the order of 1 for every 7 we execute. That is an intolerable error rate. If you were brought to a hospital and you were scheduled for life-threatening surgery, and some laboratory had to do a test to see whether or not you had a tumor that was malignant or benign, and that laboratory, in 1 out of 7 cases, was just making a mistake about whether your tumor was malignant or benign, well, that lab wouldn't last 10 seconds.
This system, as long as mankind, who man is not perfect, and as long as mankind is running it, you can never have a system with the death penalty, ever. That is in a perfect society, you could have it. But anything short of that, you cannot, because all 75 of us that are released, and that's not even mentioning those that are innocent that are still there, just the 75 of us that have been released, they killed us, who we were.
Death penalty supporters rejected the Northwestern Conference as propaganda.
These radicals in Chicago who are having this conference that we're talking about here cannot point to a case where someone who was innocent was put to death. These people that you're talking about are all alive. Let's assume that these people are innocent. To me, that proves that the system works.
To be told after that, and to lose your family, to be broken and damaged, to be told after all of that the system works is cruel. It's cruel.
While those at the conference discussed ways to avoid mistakes that lead to improper convictions, the former inmates remained firm in opposition to the death penalty.
We should give great pause before we hand out the ultimate sentence. Because if it could happen to me, it could happen to you. Thank you.
Wrongful convictions represent a tragic failure of our criminal justice system. Why do our courts, supposedly the best in the world, make so many mistakes? Here's Professor Arthur Miller.
We'd like to put blinders on and assume that everyone in prison is guilty. But the truth is that maybe as many as 10% have been wrongfully convicted. We've tried to create a system that includes as much protection for the accused as possible, but it just isn't going to work all of the time. We hit periods in which crazy, nasty things happen. We know that police occasionally falsify evidence. We have prosecutors who are too zealous, who want to win at any cost. There are incompetent and overworked defense attorneys. We have judges who doze off at the wrong times. And we have juries that are concerned about their own safety. When you get into periods of high crime, those jurors don't want to hear about proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They just want to put people away. The criminal justice system works very hard, and it does get better as time goes on. One wishes that the system were infallible, but the basic truth is it's a human system, and there is no human system that is infallible.
I'm Jay Shadler. Thanks for being with us. Join us again as we look behind the headlines at crime, punishment, and the law on the next edition of Justice.